At this point, you should have a good understanding of what GMOs are, the types of information that are available about them, and the scientific consensus on whether or not GMOs are safe. I do want to mention that GMO is genetically modified organisms, and you may also see GE food, so genetically engineered food. Really, genetic modification or genetic engineering are the same thing. We can talk about, so GMO is a little bit broader of a term than GE because genetically modified organisms include animals that might be used for livestock or other purposes, so maybe even lab rats or something like that. GE is usually referring to food, so genetically engineered foods. Those are genetically modified organisms because they're plants, but they can also be called GE foods. So those really can be used interchangeably. So at this point, I just want to make sure that we cover this fairly. I want to ask the question, should GMOs or GE foods get a free pass? Should we just say, oh, science says they're safe, let's use them and use them all over the place? And my answer to that would be no. We shouldn't just give them a free pass, and I'll explain my thoughts here. So first of all, you should know that all of the fear-mongering and scary things that you hear about GMOs in your food are largely unfounded. So that first source that you saw, that you read, really there isn't much scientific information to support that. But we do need to know a little bit more information, and I think this is where critical thinking is really important. So first of all, looking at this figure, it shows the dramatic increase that we've seen in the use of GM crops since 1996. So this is showing the percent of planted acres of crops in the United States from 1996 to 2013. And if we look at this, we can see here there are different types of genetically modified crops shown here. But HT corn is one type of GM corn. 85% of crops are currently HT corn. 75% of crops of corn fields planted are BT corn. We have 75% of BT cotton. We have 82% HT cotton and 93% HT soybeans. So the reality is that the majority of your food coming from corn or soybeans is coming from genetically modified plants. The majority of the cotton used for your clothes is coming from genetically modified plants. So it's out there, it's been out there, and it's increased dramatically. But there are a few questions that we need to keep in mind, and we should never just let anything really get a free pass. So the things we need to keep in mind is what is or are the motivations for using and developing genetically modified plants? Are they safe? They continuously need to be tested. Any new crop needs to be tested. And as you saw in the first video, there is a pretty rigorous process for testing the safety of those things. And then the last one is it sustainable? Of course, that's going to be important in this class. Okay, so let's take a look at a few motivations that could be there for developing and using genetically modified crops. The first motivation here is pest resistance. So resistance to usually insect pests, or it could be fungal pests or maybe bacterial pests. So anything that could cause damage to a plant, cause disease in a plant that would devastate your crop, it would be beneficial to have crops that have genes that make them resistant to those diseases. So examples of these include BT corn, potatoes, and cotton. These are plants that have been given a gene, this bacterial gene here. It's been inserted into the crops, and so they produce a toxin that bacterial gene causes to be produced, and that toxin kills insects. Now, at first you think, oh my gosh, I am eating corn that produces insect toxin. That sounds disgusting and horribly unsafe. Well, it turns out the effects of this in the insects have been studied rigorously. And the way that toxin works it would never work in a human or even a mammal's body. So, for example, the gut of the insects that eat corn, for example, they actually have guts that are more alkaline or basic than we do. Our stomachs, our guts are acidic. And so this toxin would never even work in the acidic environment in our stomachs. That has been tested. The safety of this has been tested, even though they didn't think it would cause a problem. It was tested still, and it was found not to cause a problem. So yes, toxin sounds scary, but it is a toxin specific to insects. But we still need to consider the pros and cons of pest-resistant GM crops. So the pros. If you have crops with genes that make them resistant to pests, then you'll have to spray fewer pesticides. We do know that pesticides can have health effects on people and animals, and so fewer pesticides will always be a good thing. And that fewer pesticides results in lower production costs. I've talked to some farmers, and they'll tell you that one of their largest costs in producing crops is the spraying of pesticides. Those pesticides are very expensive. Cons, perhaps potential health effects. BT appears to be pretty safe, but maybe a new one we would always have to test to make sure that they are not harmful to human or other animal health. Does inserting this gene affect the nutrition of the plant? Again, that can be tested. One of the things, and this is probably the biggest scientific concern for GM crops, is that the way that plants reproduce, they spread pollen. A lot of them spread pollen to other plants. And so the question is, could the pollen from corn, for example, be carried by the wind to native plants, wild species near the field, and then those species get that gene, and now that gene has been introduced to the wild population, and it shouldn't have been there. So that really is probably one of the biggest concerns for GM crops. And then the other thing is, here we're trying to kill specific pests, but if other insects that maybe wouldn't cause disease or wouldn't cause such a big problem eat a little bit of that corn, it's going to kill them too. And so we have to be careful with the killing non-target insect species or other pest species. Okay, so see how we have to weigh the pros and cons. That's critical thinking. You should never just take something at face value, and you should never just say, yes, it's safe, or no, it's not safe. There is a lot of gray area here, and so you need to be aware of that. Okay, another motivation for GM crops is crops can be made herbicide resistant. So for example, Roundup Ready soybeans or corn, which is a product of Monsanto. There's also Knockout by Syngenta. There's another, I just put these names in here because you might hear them. Nature Guard by Mycogen. These are all companies, biotechnology companies that produce these GM crops. The one thing that we need to think about is Monsanto produces Roundup Ready corn or Roundup Ready soybeans, but it also produces Roundup. And so there is definitely a conflict of interest there. If you purchase Roundup Ready corn, then you have to also purchase their Roundup, and they have pretty strict trademarks on their products. And so there's a lot of legal issues here. And these legal issues really, we could get into issues of corporations and the power of corporations, and there certainly is a lot of that going on with these big biotech companies, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this. And I know some of you would be really interested in learning about that, but we're not going to get into it because we could probably all rant and rave about that for a long time. So I don't mean to say those issues are not important, but I do want to stick to the science here and the environmental impacts. So let's look at the pros and cons here. The pro is that farmers can spray their fields liberally without harming their plants. So that reduces time and effort and cost for farmers, and ultimately that results in maybe cheaper products for the consumer. Okay, so really this is to make the farmer's job easier. The con, though, is that what's happening is that we're starting to get some resistance, that are resistant to herbicides, so weeds that are resistant to herbicides. So as the resistance to those herbicides increases, and this is happening pretty quickly, and that's an example of evolution, due to the genetic diversity, going back to a previous vocab word, the genetic diversity of the weeds allows some of them to survive with Roundup, even though most of them die. And so the ones that survive then are there to pass on those resistance genes. And so we're seeing increases in herbicide resistance. So I think of all of the motivations for GM crops, herbicide resistance is probably the most suspect, and also probably the one that's going to result in the most problems. Okay, finally, another motivation for GM crops is to add nutrients to foods. So if we take a look at this map here, it shows global vitamin A deficiency. And in your textbook, the chapter that goes along with agriculture talks about overnutrition and undernutrition or malnutrition. Places like the United States suffer from overnutrition. We have a lot of health issues due to eating too much. Other places that suffer from a lot of malnutrition. So places like what you see here in red or orange have clinical or severe subclinical vitamin A deficiency. That's just one example of malnutrition. 1/3 of the world's food, 1/3 of the world is food or nutrient insecure. That means that they're not sufficiently able to supply their populations with food, and even if they can maybe provide a lot of food, like rice, for example, that rice doesn't have all the nutrients that people need, so that location may have a lot of food, but not a lot of nutrients. So 1/3 of the world is food or nutrient insecure. So genetic modification can lead to higher nutrients. So we can insert genes to cause a plant to generate vitamin A, for example. On the left here is an example, a GM crop called golden rice, and that causes an increase in the vitamin A and iron content of that rice. So if you lived in one of these countries that are clinically vitamin A deficient and you started growing GM golden rice, then perhaps that would solve that vitamin A deficiency problem. So pros to this obviously is you can generate more nutrients to fight nutrient insecurity across the world. Obviously, that's a really good thing. Cons are, there are some issues again with the legality and trademarks from those big biotech companies. If they come into a country here, let's say in the middle of the African continent, and say, here's golden rice, and some people didn't want to grow it, that there are some legal issues there. So that's one of the cons. Another con is the effects that this could have, again, if that GM gene got out into wild populations. Okay, so let's close with kind of the future of genetically modified crops. First of all, studies need to continue. We need to continue to make sure that genetically modified genes are not getting out into wild populations and affecting those populations. Those would be the major effects on the environment. Also, generating pesticide-resistant crops, or maybe even BT-resistant crops. That's happening too. So monitoring those types of things. I'm sorry, BT-resistant pests. Make sure that there is always rigorous testing of GM crops before they're allowed to go out into populations and be sold. There's still a question of, should we label GM foods? The GM makers would say no, because that will stigmatize them, but people who want to make sure that they're rigorously tested and studied say yes, so that's still a question. Keep in mind that GM crops are probably more sustainable than spraying pesticides all over the fields. We could use GM crops to make drought-resistant crops. So all of these things need to be considered.